think where would be the place to start? Many ways would be, I think, sort of at the start in some ways, because I think when we're thinking about knowledge and the things that we need to do now, because we're certainly in a moment where we're having discussions which in some ways are of a different tenor to the ones we've had in the past. We're thinking about what should we be thinking about, particularly in universities. We've got decolonizing the curriculum, post George Floyd, we've got companies talking about, and the government to some extent talking about what we should be doing in terms of knowledge and ideas, maybe not the government, but certainly civil society. So we're in an interesting moment to discuss where we're at. But what we really need to do, I would suggest, is to really go back to the beginning and think about what we think, even what do we think that knowledge is, right? Like we even have a very particular view and problematic view of what knowledge is, where it comes from, where it's produced, what the role of knowledge is, which are really steeped in some quite problematic ideas. So when we're thinking about how do we change society, the idea about what is knowledge, what kind of knowledge do we need, how do we produce knowledge, is such an important thing which we don't always discuss, right? So yeah, this effectively what I'm trying to argue and have been arguing for the last a long time is that we need to go all the way back, right? The society can only be as equal as the knowledge that it is founded upon, and in the same vein, if our society is so deeply unequal, and it is today, as unequal as it has ever been, and may actually be more unequal now than it has ever been, given the extremes of wealth and the extremes of poverty, then there is something clearly wrong with the knowledge that we have, right? So we need a new knowledge, a new framework, a new set of framing ideas which can help us chart a new course. And that sounds all well and good, but as I said, I'm going to split this in two parts. So one, we're going to go back and we're going to say, well, actually, what are the problems? What is the key problem that we have in terms of knowledge and in terms of the impact of society? And I would argue quite strongly that the key problem is that the framework of knowledge we have is very much rooted in white supremacy, which explains why the outcomes that we have in the world are very much influenced by white supremacy. But because of the frameworks that we have, which are so influenced by white supremacy, we actually don't think about these frameworks as being white supremacists in themselves, right? So one of the things we've been talking about extensively in terms of the curriculum is the canon, right? It is what is the key thinkers, the key foundation, the key ideas, and we have to accept that in the Western university, certainly in the UK and Europe, etc., the dominant kind of canon of knowledge is the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment thinkers, Enlightenment ideas, Enlightenment ideals, this idea of rationality and thought, and how do we get to the place, how do we understand the world, is through this set of Enlightenment ideals. And really importantly, we tend to think about those ideals as being neutral, as being separate from other ideas, right? Like, there's been a lot of critique of objectivity, which is I won't go into, but just the idea of rationality itself, right? The idea that you can understand the world through a particular method and mechanism of engagement, deeply problematic. And some of those discussions we've had in philosophy of science, certainly around objectivism, et cetera, right? And what we've missed in that is that those ideas, the very idea of the rational being is deeply rooted and tied up in white supremacy, colonial violence, and imperialism. I mean, you literally cannot separate the two, right? If you think about when the Enlightenment happened, and even what allows the Enlightenment to happen, is built off the back of colonial barbarity, right? So, if you think about the very idea of the Enlightenment as a intellectual movement, right? That knowledge flows out of Europe and goes to the rest of the world. That idea can only be sustained after about 2 centuries of some of the worst, most brutal violence the world has ever seen. Because prior to the Enlightenment, in this first, like in the 15th century, 200 years prior to the Enlightenment, 15th century, the Europe's behind, like very behind. Europe may be the only part of the world in a dark age at this point. 1492 is a really important turning point in the world. That's when Columbus sails the ocean blue, bumps into the Americas and calls them, thinks he's going to India. At that point, Europe is really far behind. Like it's behind the Americas, it's behind Africa, it's behind Asia, it's behind. The idea of the Enlightenment knowledge coming out of Europe and spreading to the rest of the world would be insane at that point in time because it was so ridiculous. It would have been a ridiculous notion. Like 1492 is also important because it's also the same year the Moors are kicked out of Spain. You know, and the Arab world is very much at that point dominant center of knowledge. Nobody would argue at this point. This is that's where the libraries are. North Africa, you have Timbuktu, which has more books there's more books in one city in North Africa than there are in Europe at that point. So what changes between 1492 and the 18th century? What is it that shifts that allows the conceit of the Enlightenment to happen? The idea that white people are superior, the idea that knowledge flows through Europe and that the rational human being is a white man. What happens in those 200 years? What happens in those 200 years is, like I said, it's some of the worst violence the planet's ever seen. So the largest genocide in human history is kicked off in 1492 by Columbus, right? The discovery of the Americans, which this was even recent. When I was writing this book, I knew it was bad, but the scale of it was news to me because we don't discuss this genocide anywhere near enough. This estimated that anywhere between 60 and 70 million natives in the Americas were killed in a very short period of time, right? If you take Hispaniola, what they call Hispaniola, what we would now call Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where Columbus landed in 1492 and did most of his damage, the midpoint estimate, and this surprised me because I always had this thought it was a lot of people, but probably a few less. The midpoint estimate of the amount of people on that island when Columbus landed is 8 million. So there's lots lower and there's lots higher, but 8 million is the middle point, right? Now, Columbus lands in 1492, goes back to Spain, comes back in 1495, and departs after he's been governor until 1512. By 1512, the midpoint estimate of the amount of native Taino people left on the island is that it's gone from 8 million to just 20,000. I mean, imagine the scale of death that we're talking about. And that's replicated across the Americas. In some places, up to 98, 99% of the population is wiped out. It is no doubt the largest genocide in human history. It took me a while to get my head around this, but the impact of that was so stark because you had, civilized communities. You had, they were burning fossil fuels. They were deeply organized. Erasing that civilization off the face of the earth actually made the climate cool, the global climate cool, because there was less fossil fuels being produced because so many people died. That's the impact we're talking about, right? That in so many ways opens up the prosperity we then see from the West. So at this point, remember, Europe isn't really the West, it's just Europe. Travels westward, is behind, is finding civilizations, is finding that Africans had actually already come to the Americas maybe 1,000 years earlier, couldn't possibly conquer Africa, and actually only really conquers the Americas because of disease. So disease, and this is usually a reason given why we don't call it a genocide, because it is mostly disease which kills the indigenous population. But Europeans knew what they were doing. They purposely did. They knew exactly what they were doing. Purposefully used biological warfare in many examples, but generally just left the natives. It didn't really took into account the fact they were killing everybody else through diseases. But it really is disease which wastes away the population, and then this unlocks this unprecedented period of wealth and development for the West. You think about it's firstly it's Spain and it's Portugal. And the two first commodities are gold and silver, hugely important. That gold and silver gives access to wealth and resources that Europe is able to then brings back into Europe. That gold and silver also allows Europe to trade into Asia. So actually the first demand for silver and gold from the Americas, and this was mostly places like Brazil, was actually the East. It was China. China was demand for silver. India was demand for gold. In fact, the Taj Mahal is gold from mines in Brazil, right? So this is allowing Europe to catch up. It's allowing Europe to develop wealth, to develop money, develop commerce. It's when you start to get finance capitalism start to develop out of gold and silver. And then it is the next phase, which is really the one where you get the boom production, the Industrial Revolution, And again, if we think about what are the commodities that lead to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, it's cotton, it's tobacco first, it's cotton, it's tobacco, sugar, and then cotton. All of these grown in the Atlantic system. Without the Atlantic system, there simply isn't, Europe simply doesn't develop the wealth possible to have industrial development, right? So it's through this Atlantic system, and obviously there's slavery in the Atlantic system, there's colonialism because they've colonized the Caribbean, America, etc., and then obviously slavery, the transatlantic slave trade. The reason I'm here, right, in England via Jamaica, the wealth that derives, that's the wealth, that's the wellspring through which you have industrial development, etc. So by the 18th century, when when people like Immanuel Kant or even earlier John Locke, Voltaire, when they're all sitting in Europe, and Europe's dominant now, Europe's wealthy, Europe is driving industry, they are able then to argue that the West is supreme. The white people are supreme because they live in a world where Africans are enslaved, the natives in the Americas have been wiped out. Britain now has the money to go and conquer India and start to get into India. So the place that they theorize this white supremacy from, of the Enlightenment, is built on the bodies of hundreds of millions of black and brown people. Now, you cannot separate that condition from the conceit of the Enlightenment, right? So when you get the promise we were given with science, scientific reasoning, rationality, etc., was that the old ideas of religion and backwards ideas of people being superior, inferior, are supposed to melt away. But actually, what happens is they don't melt away; they become far more sedimented because they become based in science, right? Based in fact. And someone like Immanuel Kant, who, I mean, to be honest, I didn't know how sacred Kant was until I went on Newsnight and just pointed out that Immanuel Kant was racist. And that was the one time I trended on Twitter because people got really mad, like, "What? You can't call Immanuel Kant a racist." I mean, Immanuel Kant would be upset if you didn't call him a racist. He was like so racist. He's not even close. Like, and this was a surprise. And I knew the broad strokes of this before I wrote The New Age of Empire, but the devil really is in the detail. Kant was not just a racist. Kant was so racist, he actually wrote instructions for slave owners of how best to beat the Negro, because in his strange racial theory, he believed our skin was too thick and that a whip wouldn't do the job. You had to get a split bamboo cane and that would get the blood out of us and inflict the most damage. I mean, this is Immanuel Kant. There's no doubt Immanuel Kant was one of the most, let's just read any of them. Read Immanuel Kant. He's one of the most racist people you could possibly pick up in a textbook. The defense of Kant, and this is usually the defense of Western ideas of knowledge and reason, is that, yeah, he was a racist, but kind of everybody is racist back then. And you can separate his racism from his moral philosophy, right? Like, no reason to throw out the critique of pure reason, because that's not really racist. His other stuff was racist, but that wasn't. And that's problematic because actually a large section of Kant's output is just racism. He called it moral geography, where he theorized that Africa was backwards, Asia was a bit better. There was basically a hierarchy: white people at the top, black people at the bottom, hierarchy in between. And that was a lot of his writing, not a little bit of his writings, a lot of his writings. And he actually says himself, you cannot separate his moral geography from his moral philosophy, because his basic argument is the reason that he can make his arguments about reason and rights, etc., is because he is white, because he is superior to the rest of the world. That is how he has access to these great ideas of rationality, etc. And those rights, his framework of rights then is embedded with this idea of white supremacy, right? Like deeply embedded with the idea of white supremacy. Now, you just simply can't separate the two things. They're part of the same body of work. The other defense you tend to get of someone like Kant, in particular in the Enlightenment, more generally, is that as it goes older, and Kant, starts off, giving instructions and advice to slave owners, and by the end, by the time he dies, he's against slavery. He's against colonialism in some ways. So he's saying, actually, you should we shouldn't be doing the things we've been doing for the last 100 or so, 100, 200 years, right? And this is usually used to defend him. But if you actually look at what the arguments he's making, the reason he's making these, points about being against slavery, being against violent colonialism. I would say violent colonialism, not against colonialism. He certainly was never against colonialism, but violent colonialism. The reason he gives is embedded in his idea of rights, right? The universal right that humans have is, and this is language we use today still, is the right to life, right? Is the right not to be dictated to, the right not to be controlled externally, physically, yeah? And he actually, I mean, he basically argues that the rights that Africans have are basically the same as the rights that animals have or monkeys have today, right? I can argue that you shouldn't mistreat gorillas, you shouldn't poach gorillas. That gorillas should be free to live by themselves in their own land, etc., etc. Doesn't mean I believe that gorillas are fully human. And Kant never believed that we were fully human. He never gave up his moral geography, but he gave us a set of rights that allows us to freeze Africans in this state of barbarity, while at the same time pretending that we have universal human rights. The universal human rights framework from Kant, which is the very universal human rights framework we still use today, is one that completely and utterly justifies racial imperialism. Completely. And the worst thing about it is that it makes us feel better because we say universal rights, etc., etc., and we pretend that this is somehow progressive. So think about that in a context where the UN, United Nations, which in terms of philosophy, Kant is hugely important in the philosophy of the UN and human rights framework, this idea of the right to life, etc. The UN is the body that really protects the world's human rights, if you like. Is it a coincidence that we live in a world where race, white supremacy in particular, is clearly the framing logic of economic disparity? So I wanted the slide, if I could put up slides, the slide I would put up is an image. You can map, there's like various maps you can use where you put GDP per capita and different countries. And what you will see is that the poorest countries in the world are in sub-Saharan, so-called sub-Saharan Africa. The poorest, the black place, right, is where the most poverty is. Then the West, where white people live, is the richest. And then there is this hierarchy in between, right, with some Asian countries emerging, etc., but a very clear ladder of white supremacy. It is exactly that ladder of white supremacy that you will find in Kant's moral geography. And surely it cannot be a coincidence that that's the world we inhabit when we have a framework of human rights from people like Immanuel Kant and the Enlightenment. But we have and so if you're going to understand global inequality, there is no possible way you could do this genuinely without taking into account race. Because it really is, like, it's so racial, it's so blindingly obvious when you look at any of the stats, etc., etc. But the United Nations, the body that's supposed to protect the human rights of everybody, go on their website, look for the documentation. You will find almost no reference to race in that regard. There's race in terms of xenophobia and racism, etc. But race in the economy, race as a way to explain how we under development, race as a framing logic for not there, completely absent, completely post-racial framework of rights in a world that is clearly more than anything defined by racial imperialism. That's the problem with the knowledge that we have. And I've used Kant because Kant's just a really easy example of that. But you could say that for basically anything. Look at psychology, look at sociology, look at politics, look at all of it. The intellectual heritage that we base our knowledge on, particularly in the universities, is white supremacy, and it doesn't allow us to properly understand what is happening. It's actually the purpose of it is to distort us away from thinking of actually realizing what is happening and to essentially maintain the status quo. All right, which brings me to the point about universities specifically. So if you think about the university as it emerges in the West, and what is the key problem with the university, it is that it picks up this idea of the intellectual, of knowledge, of legitimate knowledge, in particular scientific knowledge. It picks that up from this conceit of the Enlightenment. The idea that the best way to understand the world is to be detached from it, is to be above it, is to be hover above it in some crazy position of intellectual supremacy. And then this is how we engage with the world, separate from the world. So the idea that rationality is to think. The chapter in the book this is all from is called, I called it "I'm white, therefore I am," right? Because there is this idea you get from the Enlightenment that to be rational, to be fully human, to be superior is to be detached from your body. And that's defined very clearly in relation to other groups who are very much connected to their bodies. So the savages, the Africans are the worst. Africans are the most unintelligent because they are the most body. They're the most emotional. We can't think abstractly, right? So what you have in the way the university is set up is this idea that the university should be separate. It should be apart from, and this is where you get those critiques of the philosophy of science around objectivism, etc., 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 which to some extent we've dealt with, I would say, throughout the years. So, well, I say to some extent, but if you actually look at the way that the university is organized, it's really based on those premises, right? So, what's the best? One of those ways would be the kinds of ways that we discuss, the kinds of ways that we write, the audience for our work. So if we think about how did I become professor, I had to write journal articles that you can actually, most of the time you can only access if you're in higher education, right? You know, the politics of producing journal articles, etc. Books, academic books, again, hugely expensive unless you're in a university library, right? And then there's a whole way of producing knowledge that keeps it internal. Speak to students in the university, go to conferences, talk to other academics. There is a bubble that is created, which is really almost entirely separate from the real world, right? Like there are academic celebrities, and most people would have no idea who on earth you were talking about, right? Because it's a completely different world. It's a self-referential bubble where we talk to ourselves, talk to each other, peer review each other, and then get credit through the bubble, right? It's separate, entirely separate. And it's not just about, and one of the things that's changed now, certainly, open access, we're supposed to be able to, our work has to be accessible, etc., etc. That doesn't deal with the problem because one, it's still produced in that same way. So there's still a way of training, a way of engaging, a way of knowing, the tools that we have to learn about the world are still very, 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 very problematic and internal. The key knowledge that we have to go through. So I'm become a professor of sociology. Well, I was a professor of Black Studies, but my PhD in sociology. The canon through which I had to go through was just a series of dead white men. I took it upon myself to go and read lots of other stuff and become a professor of Black Studies. But the legitimacy to get to this position is based not on any of that. It's based on my ability to understand and to work in the ways which have been well established and which are hugely problematic. Second part why the open access thing is a distraction would be, it's not just that people can't read the stuff that we write. It's that even if they could read it, they probably wouldn't want to, right? Because the way that we have to write, the way that we have to engage, the language that we use, the style, the nature of it. I don't like reading most academic work, and I am an academic. So why would the public, right? Because there is something about the way that we think about knowledge where it is deeply embedded in this elite idea, right? This elite intellectual, separate from the rest of the world, etc., etc., etc. But that can't be separated again from that move in the Enlightenment and whiteness. That really is a white supremacy ideal, right? Even though it has gendered aspects, certainly, it has class aspects, certainly, the production of that idea is deeply rooted in whiteness. White supremacy, how do you understand the world? What is it to be an intellectual? It is to be rational, separate, white, etc. They're all mingled in together. So if you think about where do we go from here and the knowledge that we're going to produce, and this is ironic coming from a professor talking at a university, right? But we have to be honest and say that actually university produced knowledge has been a major part of the problem, maybe the most important part of the problem in framing a world that we have today, right? In framing a world where one, racism is still rampant, and two, we've kind of ignored the fact that racism is still rampant. There's a quote that I wish I had come up with, but I didn't. It was from Deepa Nayak, who organizes This Is Not a Gateway in London, where she says, the university is not racist, the university is racism. And if you actually think about the idea of race, the idea of race in biology and genetics, etc., racial science, I mean, that really is actually a production of university. And they go back to the Enlightenment figures who still are the dominant basis of knowledge that we still use today. All of them, every single one of them, Locke, Voltaire, Hume, all of them agreed that in racial science. The black people were inferior, white people were superior. There was a hierarchy in between. There was a bit of variety about how you justify that, about the order of the different people, but generally they all generally agreed upon that. Um, and then and which make and then if you also think about the the institution of what the university is, right? So it's not just like in the past this happened and that was bad, and we still got the legacy of knowledge. In the very recent past, I don't know if you can hear my children crying. I've got children crying behind me. I'm not sure if you can hear that. But in the very recent past, and this is where I disagree with some of my colleagues about the university, there is this idea because we have neoliberalism and because things are getting terrible and they are worse in many ways. There was a great heyday in the 60s of the public university. Well, in the 60s, only about 5% of the population went to university. I mean, it was just the province for rich white men. The reason that the university was the public for the public good is because there was very few people went. It was the elite, and the government was perfectly happy to spend money to facilitate that, right? It's only, I mean, in the UK, widening participation's what, 92? I mean, it's really recent that there's been any serious diversity in the university. These have been spaces where we've actually been in at all. Staff diversity is still terrible anyway. Only 1% of academics are black. I'm one of 150 black professors in the entire country. I mean, we literally are banned from getting on a plane together just in case there's an accident, and then there's none of us left, right? That's how bad the problem is. So when we're talking about the university, it's never been a place that has produced anti-racist knowledge. That really hasn't. I mean, it's only recently you've had any scholars in the university really dedicated. Maybe a handful you could go back in the early 20th century, but as a whole, certainly not. And more broadly now, I could make the argument, and strongly would make the argument, that even though there are critical scholars within the university, the main body of stuff that comes out of the university is still, in a very, very real way, just as much about maintaining the racial status quo as it ever was, because it's still based on the same logics, it's still based on the same exclusions, it's the same problem. It's a structural problem about what university knowledge is and how it's produced. So that's still pretty negative. I'm going to try to be more positive as I get. I do work at a university, and one of the things that we can do, and certainly the university gives you the scope to do, and we definitely don't do this enough, is it is one of the only places where you do have quite a lot of freedom, right? So as an academic and certainly as a professor, there is space, there is some time lesser with neoliberalism, but it is a place where you have certain amounts of freedom to do, I can come and talk about this, I can write books about black radicalism, I can spend lots of time doing organization and activism, etc. So what we need to do is to use our privileges to do those things. And what we've done with Black Studies is very much to say, we need to find knowledge elsewhere, right? We need to validate other forms of knowledge. If you want, I mean, it would be actually impossible to do a whole degree in Black Studies and your reading list just cited just black academics full stop. Forget when I talk about politics of it, the radical nature of it, just black, it would actually be impossible to have a whole degree that cited just black academics, because there hasn't been that many of us, right? Particularly historically, when you're looking back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there's the way that we produce knowledge has very much been outside the university. So although Black Studies is new in the university, it is not new in the UK. There's 50, 60, 70, you could argue there's 100 years tradition of Black Studies in the UK. It's just been in organizations, right? It's been in other places. The British Black Power movement very much was about education. It was about ideas. We had supplementary schools that taught on the weekends. We had the bookshop movement. We had whole events, conferences, not really academic conferences, but conferences that brought in speakers from around the world. There was a whole different set of ideas that got mobilized, that got produced, that got recirculated, that were put into activism, etc., etc. And that's the legacy of Black Studies that we have. So what we basically said is, look, that Black Studies tradition, which has for a long time been outside the university, we just brought it into the university and validated that as a form of knowledge through academia. And for many reasons, I don't think that should be necessary. Unfortunately, it is. But what that also does then is it allows us to basically to subvert the purpose of the university, right? Like the term that I typically use for what we're trying to do is not to decolonize the university, because frankly, you cannot decolonize it. It is what it is. It is a production of racial imperialism, and therefore the university is purpose will be racial imperialism until the society is not about racial imperialism, right? But what you can do and what we try to do is to colonize the university, using the position that we have, using the relative authority that we have, etc., the resources that we have. We've created a space which we can do different things, right? We can connect to a different set of knowledge and understanding. We can connect to community. We can spend lots of time organizing outside of the university. We can put students into contact with groups, etc., etc. And in our little space, we're doing something very, very different. But I also recognize it is something which really subverts the very nature of the institution that gives me particularly the privilege to do that work, right? That's the contradiction that we always have to be, that we have to be in. Otherwise, where do you go, right? Because, and I guess that's the transformative power of education and knowledge. And all of us in academia have to acknowledge that we have these privileges, right? We are privileged. We're privileged in terms of economically privileged, status privileged, even with neoliberalism, it's problematic, believe me. But we have a particular role, and from that we can subvert it. I'm going to end on an example which I don't know. I think it's positive, but it's sort of negative at the same time. But I think it's a nice metaphor to think about. As a reason, I don't usually use professor too much, because the title of professor is, you could trace that title back very much to everything I just said. It's problematic, racially problematic as well. But in many ways, I would say that my position is like what we had on the plantation. So on the plantation, you had slave preachers. There were people who were, and the role of the slave preacher essentially was to educate the enslaved into slavery. But that was the purpose of it. It was supposed to give you a particular version of Christianity that would pacify you, that would make you want to be a slave, that would make you not resist, etc., etc. And many people did this. That was a job, maintain the status quo, basically. But you also found that a number of the slave rebellions, the Shamshat Rebellion in Jamaica, Nat Turner in America, Denmark Vesey, a number of the slave rebellions were actually started by the slave pastor. Why? Because the slave pastor or slave preacher had this elevated status. One was able to read, and most of the instances you'd be killed if you were enslaved and you learned to read. And what they read was, they read the whole Bible, and they took inspiration from that and understood there were different ways to think about freedom. They could also talk to large groups of people. Talking to large groups of people on a plantation was totally, again, you'd be killed, you'd be died. You wouldn't be able to do that, only in the context of Christian service. And the third thing was important, they were able to travel between plantations freely, and has had lots and lots of this autonomy. And I said, vast majority of slave preachers just use that position to maintain the status quo, but you have many, many, many examples who use that position to undermine it and to foment rebellion. This is the role that we should be thinking of ourselves as academics. One, it's good because it's critical and it makes us uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable metaphor. But two, it also gives us the scope to imagine we can always undermine our position, even in slavery. You can undermine your position. We can certainly undermine our position there. So I think it gives us an impetus to think about how can we really produce a radical, different, transformative version of knowledge that can actually put us on a completely different path going forward. And I'll stop there.
Okay.